You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In 1819, the United States experienced its first major financial crisis, known as the Panic of 1819, which had significant effects on the country's economy and slowed down the expansion into the Western Cotton Belt. This crisis marked the beginning of America's shift from a colonial economy heavily reliant on Europe to a more independent economic system. The trouble started due to adjustments in the global markets after the Napoleonic Wars, but it got worse because of too much speculation in land and the unchecked printing of paper money by banks and businesses. The Second Bank of the United States, which had been playing its part in these risky financial practices, tried to fix things by suddenly reducing the amount of money it lent out, especially in the western states as of 1818. However, when people started asking for gold in exchange for the bank's paper money, the state banks, which didn't have enough gold, began seizing properties they had loaned money on. This action, combined with a rebound in European farm production in 1817, led to a wave of bankruptcies and widespread unemployment. This financial catastrophe and the following recession led to a lot of anger towards banks and skepticism about the federal government's approach to managing the economy. It stirred political activism among Americans who now wanted to safeguard their local economic interests. The new Republicans and their policies, which included tariffs, infrastructure development, and the Second Bank of the United States, faced a lot of criticism and had to be vigorously defended. On December 24, 1814, the United States and the United Kingdom shook hands on the Treaty of Ghent, putting an end to the War of 1812. By signing this treaty, the British essentially stopped trying to enforce their strict trade rules on the US, paving the way for free trade and opening up America's vast western territories to exploration and development. At that time, Europe was trying to find its footing after the Napoleonic Wars, shifting back to a peaceful economy, which wasn't easy. This shift caused a drop in prices globally because there wasn't enough gold and silver money going around. During the war, Britain had increased its industrial output to meet the demand, but once the war ended, Europe couldn't buy all these British goods because it was still recovering from the damage caused by years of fighting. Not to mention, Europe's farms were struggling to produce enough food for its people after being worn out by the war. The economic turmoil in Europe spilled over to the United States, leading to what's known as the Panic of 1819. American manufacturers were hit hard as British goods, made cheaper by lower wages, flooded the US market, putting many factories out of business. However, with Europe in such bad shape agriculturally, they needed to import food, creating a new opportunity for American farmers to export crops like cotton, wheat, corn, and tobacco. This demand drove up prices and led to a land boom in the southern and western United States, as people rushed to buy land hoping to make a fortune. Government policies made it easy to buy this land, fueling the speculation further. Historian George Dangerfield put it succinctly when he said, "The entire post-war American economy was based on a land boom." This period of inflation and speculation lasted from 1815 to 1818, masking the broader trend of falling prices worldwide. After the First Bank of the United States wasn't rechartered in 1811, the government's ability to regulate state banks stopped. Credit-friendly Republicans, including entrepreneurs, bankers, and farmers, embraced a hands-off financial approach that aligned with the Jeffersonian idea of political freedom. They viewed land speculation as embodying the spirit of independence and pioneering. These private banking interests and their allies aimed to dodge or fight off any interference in the profitability of their local businesses from government banking regulations that might restrict easy access to credit. As a result, there was a huge increase in state-chartered banks, from 88 in 1811 to 208 by 1815, especially in the Mid-Atlantic region. During the War of 1812 with the United Kingdom, the American government relied on these newly minted banks for loans, leading to a widespread issue of paper money. This trend pushed gold and silver, or hard currency, into more conservative banks in New England, leaving the newer banks short on hard cash reserves. The U.S. government, wanting to keep the liberal wartime lending going, allowed state banks to pause their gold and silver payments. This decision, made during and after the war, let both old and new banks lend money profitably, without worrying about their hard currency reserves. However, these inflationary practices led to a speculative bubble that threatened the economy's stability. By 1814, influential capitalists and economic nationalists within the Republican Party were calling for a new central bank and for bringing back regulatory controls over banking. When the War of 1812 ended, the Federalist Party fizzled out, leaving the Democratic-Republican Party in charge of the country. Interestingly, Despite their initial strict adherence to a minimal interpretation of the Constitution and a focus on agriculture, the Democratic Republicans began to change their tune. This shift was partly because the war highlighted some big problems, like inadequate infrastructure, uncontrolled banking, a lack of manufactured goods, and the untapped potential of expanding westward. This led to a new, slightly more nationalistic vibe among some of the party members, now sometimes called New Republicans or Neo-Federalists. Two prominent figures in this group were Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, and Congressman John C. Calhoun. They came up with something called the American System, which was a bit of a nod to the ideas previously promoted by their former rivals, the Federalists. This plan aimed to give the economy a boost by setting up a central banking system, expanding transportation and communication networks, and encouraging the production of goods domestically so they could be distributed across the entire nation. The big ideas pushing the American system were to set up a protective tariff to help American manufacturing grow, to invest federal funds in improving internal infrastructure like roads and canals, and to bring back the first Bank of the United States to keep the financial sector in check. These moves were all about creating a stable, thriving economy that reached every corner of the Union. During the War of 1812, the United States found itself in a financial tight spot, needing to raise $16 million through government war bonds to avoid going bankrupt because of the high costs of the war and a drop in revenue. Three key figures, financier Stephen Girard, business leader John Jacob Astor, and merchant David Parrish, stepped in to buy these bonds, essentially saving the country's credit status. They, along with influential Republican congressmen like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, pushed for a smart move. They suggested these bonds could be swapped for shares in a brand new central bank, which would be called the Second Bank of the United States. With the backing of Secretary of State James Monroe, who was keen on keeping these well-regarded pro-Republican businessmen close to government financial operations, this idea gained traction. Many Republicans, especially those from the South and West, teamed up with financial circles in the Mid-Atlantic to support the Second Bank of the United States. Congressman John C. Calhoun was particularly vocal, insisting that the federal government had a duty to manage bank credit as it's part of the national money strategy. By January 1816, he took a significant step by introducing legislation for this government bank, which Congress passed, and President James Madison signed into law in April 1816. However, not everyone was on board with the Second Bank of the United States. It faced stiff opposition from two main groups, the Tertium Quids, or Old Republicans, who saw the expansion of the central government as a threat to personal freedom and contrary to Jeffersonian principles of a farming society, and state-chartered banks that preferred their own paper money and viewed federal oversight as overreach. These tensions came to a head during President Andrew Jackson's tenure, 1829 to 1837, resulting in a bank war that ultimately led to the bank's closure by 1833. The Second Bank of the United States kicked off its operations in January 1817 under a 20-year charter, signaling a new chapter in the nation's financial history. The relaunch of the Bank of the United States aimed to accomplish two main objectives. Firstly, it sought to address the issue of inflation resulting from the practices of state-chartered banks following the war. It hoped to mitigate this by encouraging these banks to adopt a system where banknotes could be exchanged for gold or silver, a practice known as convertibility. Secondly, the bank aimed to simplify the process for the average individual to obtain credit from banks, which was intended to support businesses and foster economic growth, especially as people continued to migrate and settle in the western parts of the country. The manner in which the Bank of the United States, referred to here as the Second Bank of the United States, pursued its goals was through its role in managing finances for the U.S. Treasury Department. The process operated as follows. Whenever individuals, businesses, or importers paid their taxes or customs fees, they could utilize the state bank's paper money for these payments. The central bank would then credit these payments to the U.S. Treasury using its reserves of gold and silver. The expectation was for the state bank, which had issued the paper money, to be able to convert this paper money into gold or silver upon request, thereby reimbursing the government bank. For state banks to remain operational without depleting their reserves of gold or silver, they needed to exercise caution regarding the amount of paper money they issued as loans, despite the profitability of lending. Issuing too much paper money as loans risked their inability to exchange banknotes for gold or silver upon demand by the Second Bank of the United States, potentially leading to bankruptcy if they failed to settle their accounts with the government bank in hard money. However, the central bank's capacity to influence banks and curtail inflationary lending was limited. It primarily impacted those banks whose paper currency was frequently used for government payments, such as taxes and duties. The Second Bank of the United States and its branches had limited control over the actions of unchartered lending entities. In essence, anyone equipped with the necessary tools, plates, presses, and paper could establish a bank anywhere, be it in a church, tavern, or blacksmith shop. These unofficial banking operations were unregulated and could still affect the overall banking system, particularly in regions known for precarious banking practices, often described as wildcat banking. In October 1816, James Madison, the President of the United States, along with Alexander Dallas, the Secretary of the Treasury, gave their approval for William Jones to take over as President of the Second Bank of the United States. Jones, who had previously worked in Madison's cabinet, wasn't really selected for his expertise in banking, but for his political acumen. Not everyone was pleased about this decision, though. Stephen Girard, a financier and fellow director of the bank, and businessman John Jacob Astor expressed reservations. Girard was concerned that Jones couldn't lead the bank without prejudice, and Astor wondered if Jones was capable of managing the bank's regulatory authority. Despite these reservations, Jones went on to lead the bank generously, aligning with the period's optimistic mood after the war, which resulted in significant dividends for the bank's shareholders. His leadership style was in line with Secretary Crawford's flexible approach to handling public land receipts during a national shortage of hard currency. Moving on to the Second Bank of the United States itself, it began operation in January 1817, acting as the financial arm of the U.S. Treasury. By February 20, 1817, it was supposed to start accepting all government revenue in legal currency as outlined in its founding documents. However, there was a problem. The country was experiencing a significant shortage of hard money because it was importing more than it was exporting, and it could not accrue enough gold and silver from Peru and Mexico to bolster its reserves. To make matters more intricate, the terms for establishing the bank allowed for investors to contribute with a mix of actual metal currency and government bonds. Furthermore, the bank's directors even allowed investors to use the government stocks as security to purchase shares, effectively bypassing the requirement to pay in hard currency. Even though the plan was to have $28 million in hard currency ready for when the bank opened, they only managed to gather $2 million, forcing them to purchase hard currency at very high rates from London between 1817 and 1818, straining the bank's credit. As the deadline approached for the bank to start converting its holdings into hard currency, other state-chartered banks were not exactly keen to cooperate, fearing the central bank's control and the impact on their profits due to their issuance of paper money that could not be easily redeemed for gold or silver. On February 1, 1817, a group of bankers from Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, and Virginia met with the new Secretary of the Treasury, William H. Crawford, and Second Bank of the United States President, William Jones. They reached an agreement that really put the central bank in a difficult position in terms of asserting its authority over these private banks. The Second Bank of the United States directors, with Crawford's go-ahead, promised not to collect public deposits from state banks until July 1, 1817, and even agreed to enhance the bank's credit by allowing a $6 million discount before they started collecting public debts. This action temporarily made the private banks debtors to the central bank, enabling them to withdraw hard currency from Second Bank of the United States reserves before it could even begin to properly oversee them. This compromise, described as foreboding, indicated that the bank was facing serious challenges from its inception. In 1817, the Second Bank of the United States, or SBUS, had 18 branches operating quite independently, without much guidance from their main office in Philadelphia or from the U.S. Treasury. This structure was based on the thinking of the time, especially among Republicans during the so-called era of good feelings. They aimed to make credit more accessible to the general population and encourage people to move and settle in the Western territories. To support this westward expansion, the U.S. government made public lands available at $2 per acre with a minimum purchase requirement of 160 acres. However, the auction process slightly increased prices. Buyers were required to pay a quarter of the price up front and the remainder over 4 years. If they did not fulfill the payment in 5 years, they would forfeit the land. Because of this, the amount of money owed to the government for land jumped from $3 million in 1815 to $17 million by 1818. Interestingly, the U.S. Treasury permitted buyers to pay for this land with banknotes from local banks in the West and South, which often did not have sufficient gold or silver to support the currency they issued. This system remained functional as long as land continued to sell, forcing the Treasury to accept these less valuable notes. This made it more challenging for the government to settle debts from the war, and also helped prevent these local banks from collapsing, as these SBUS. Branches in the West and Southwest printed more money to lend to farmers and land speculators. They themselves ended up requiring more gold and silver. They attempted to acquire this by exchanging their own banknotes at SBUS. Branches in the North and East, which led to an increase in lending, these SBUS branches were supposed to regulate the system, but they merely exacerbated the problem by circulating so much of their own currency. They could not demand gold or silver payments from local banks without those banks demanding the same in return. Before the financial crisis known as the panic hit, the economy in the South and West was in a precarious state due to this rapid growth, speculation, and irresponsible banking. By July 1818, the situation at the Second Bank of the United States had become dire, with the bank holding over $22.4 million in liabilities, but only $2.4 million in gold and silver. This 10-to-1 ratio of liabilities to available gold and silver was twice what was considered manageable, setting the stage for a severe economic downturn in those regions. The financial panic that shook the United States in the early 19th century has been attributed to actions by the Second Bank of the United States, which suddenly tightened credit in the summer of 1818. This period of financial distress was compounded by environmental and international trade factors. In 1815, the eruption of Mount Tambora caused what is known as the Year Without a Summer, ruining European agriculture and setting off a chain of economic repercussions. By 1817, as Europe bounced back and produced abundant crops, American farmers and planters, who had ramped up production to meet European needs, faced a sharp decline in agricultural prices, falling by half despite increased production. The situation worsened for southwestern plantations when Britain shifted its cotton imports to East India, which offered advantages such as a longer growing season, cheaper shipping costs, and more land dedicated to cotton than the entire area of the Louisiana Purchase had. Tench Coxe, recognized as the father of the American cotton industry and a political voice of the time, highlighted the severe impact of this foreign competition. As cotton prices began to fluctuate in 1818, the United States faced the risk of a speculative bubble bursting. In response, the Bank of the United States, under William Jones, drastically reduced its lending and refused to accept notes from state-chartered banks unless they were being used for payments to the United States government. This policy shift became evident in August 1818. By October of that year, the United States Treasury called for a $2 million specie transfer from the bank to fund the Louisiana Purchase, leading to a liquidity crisis among state banks in the West and South. They couldn't meet the specie demand and started recalling loans on land they had financed, which led to a dramatic fall in land values and a wave of foreclosures, handing over many properties to the bank. The financial situation reached a breaking point in January 1819 when cotton prices collapsed by 25% in a single day, triggering a recession. The value of United States cotton and the bank's strict policies combined to bring the country to its economic knees. William Jones resigned as president of the bank, and Langdon Cheves from South Carolina took his place, marking another turn in this tumultuous period. When William Jones launched a strict policy to curtail excessive spending, his approach was taken even further by Langdon Cheves, who followed him in office. Cheves, a former congressman from South Carolina, was supported by influential figures including President James Monroe and key players at the Bank of the United States like Stephen Girard, Nicholas Biddle, as well as shareholders in favor of a more financially prudent and politically independent bank leadership. Cheves' firm monetary strategy, aiming to mitigate the financial crisis, unfortunately worsened the depression instead of helping it recover. However, he succeeded in significantly reducing the bank's debt related to land by $6 million within his first year and boosted the bank's reserve of hard currency or specie from $2.5 million in 1819 to $8 million by 1821. This led to a dramatic reduction in the amount of banknotes circulating in the economy by about $23 million over 4 years, substantially tightening the money supply. These rigorous actions did stabilize the bank by early 1819, although at a high cost to the wider population, prompting a leading critic during the so-called bank war to remark that while the bank was rescued, the people suffered greatly. As for the Panic of 1819, blaming the Second Bank of the United States entirely for it wouldn't be accurate. Its inadequacies under the leadership of Jones and Cheves notwithstanding, the bank wasn't the root cause of the financial turmoil. The crisis was the result of a complex mix of factors beyond the bank's control, including fluctuations in European markets, resistance from numerous private banks to federal rules, and a general lack of understanding of new financial systems among lenders and borrowers, which contributed to a massive expansion of credit and a land boom. According to historian George Dangerfield, even with the most adept management, the bank couldn't have stopped the panic but could have softened its blow. The financial instability of the era was indeed compounded by overlending post-war, a crash in the export market following Europe's exceptionally good harvest in 1817, competitive import prices forcing American manufacturers to shut down, an unchecked increase in state banking, and the unsound policies of the Second Bank of the United States, all culminating in widespread joblessness. President Monroe, when faced with the economic crisis, decided to focus on saving money and ensuring that the government remained financially stable. He agreed to a temporary halt on allowing bank depositors to withdraw their money in gold or silver, which later influenced similar financial crises in 1837 and 1857. Even though Monroe recognized the need for better transport links, he did not want to spend government money on these projects without changes to the Constitution. In 1821, Congress came up with a solution to help people who had bought land from the government but were struggling to pay for it. The Relief for Public Land Debtors Act meant that these individuals could keep the part of the land they had paid off and return the rest. They were also given more time to pay off their debts, with a bonus discount if they could pay quickly. This act was popular across the country, except in New England, with especially strong support from state legislatures in the rural western regions, which also passed additional assistance for debtors. The panic also led to more money being printed, mainly by the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois, which stopped requiring the banknotes to be directly exchangeable for gold or silver and issued a lot of non-exchangeable notes. Yet most states chose not to follow this path and stuck to requiring gold or silver for banknotes. The debates on these policies were heated in every state. Treasury Secretary Crawford suggested tighter control over bank lending to avoid future crises, emphasizing that it was mainly up to the states to regulate banking, leading several states to impose rules that banks maintain a certain amount of capital to secure their solvency. Another consequence of the panic of 1819 was a growing call for protective tariffs to safeguard American industry. Strong advocates like Matthew Carey, a printer from Philadelphia, blamed the economic downturn on free trade and argued that tariffs would keep American industries safe. Overall, this push for protective tariffs was mostly supported by the mid-Atlantic states, while the southern states, which relied heavily on exports, were not in favor. The economic downturn known as the Panic had a silver lining by bringing to light, for the first time, the need for policies on debt relief and support for the poor. City and state governments started taking a more effective stance on reforming public policies to help those in need, categorizing them by their abilities and the duration of their need. This shift in focus towards addressing poverty also paved the way for the creation of public education systems. Once again, there was strong public backing for protective tariffs. However, the introduction of the Tariff of Abominations in 1828 stirred regional unrest, leading to the nullification crisis. This crisis is viewed as an important early example of democratic action. In more recent discussions, many economic historians view the Panic of 1819 as the moment the United States entered into what we now consider the modern business cycle. Furthermore, the hardships caused by the panic played a role in encouraging American citizens to move to the Mexican state of Coahuila y Tejas, which would eventually become the Republic of Texas, and later a state within the United States. By the year 1830, over 12,000 Americans had moved to what we now know as the state of Texas. Various economic theories have been proposed to explain the Panic of 1819, which was essentially the first significant financial crisis in the United States. According to scholars from the Austrian School of Economics, the root cause of the recession that followed the Panic of 1819 was what they see as the earliest misstep in using expansionary monetary policy to control the economy. This perspective was notably detailed by Murray N. Rothbard in his 1962 doctoral dissertation titled The Panic of 1819, which, for a long time, stood as the only comprehensive analysis on this event. Rothbard attributed the crisis to the Austrian theory of the business cycle, highlighting how the U.S. government's heavy borrowing for the War of 1812 overstretched the bank's gold and silver reserves. This led to banks stopping the conversion of banknotes into these precious metals in 1814, and yet again during the 1819 to 1821 recession, breaching the contractual rights of those who deposited money in banks. Consequently, the rush to establish new banks and the excessive issuance of banknotes fueled unwise investments. The precarious financial situation eventually prompted the Second Bank of the United States to put an end to its growth and start a tough contraction phase, which in turn triggered a series of bankruptcies, bank failures, and mass unemployment as prices fell. On the other hand, economists who follow Keynesian economic theory view the Panic of 1819 as the young nation's introduction to the inevitable boom-bust cycles that modern economies experience. Professor Clyde Hallman of the College of William and Mary suggests that a crucial factor in the panic was the Second Bank of the U.S.'s decision to recall loans, a move that, combined with the prevailing depression and rampant speculation, signaled the dawn of a new era in American economic history. In this era, established market institutions would regularly oscillate between periods of economic growth and decline. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.